Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the abyss, about books, movies, music that I find interesting, that I enjoy, or a combination of the two. Today I'm going to be talking about The Making of a Counterculture by Theodore Roszak. This book was originally published in 1969 as a response to the growing movement of anti-authoritarian, hippie, rock and roll, psychedelic, youth movements that were developing across America at the time on university campuses and also out in California and around the country. The mainstream media at the time were very dismissive and satirical and critical towards the hippies and the youth movement in America. Theodore Roszak was a relatively young academic. I believe he was in his 30s. And he was interested in trying to find what was meaningful or promising within what he called the counterculture. I believe he coined this term, and it's a term that we still use today. Parts of this book originally appeared in The Nation, but this was collected as a kind of argument about the technocratic society and its youthful opposition. I'm going to go through the book and talk about the arguments in the different chapters of the book, because I think that what Roszak was talking about in the 60s, the late 60s, is just as relevant, if not even more relevant today. And I found this book very interesting and very inspiring, and I'd like to share some thoughts about it with you. Chapter 1, Technocracy's Children. Theodore Roszak puts forward the case that the issues of society around personal alienation, around loss of control, around environmental destruction, and around a kind of like cog-like meaningless existence, authoritarianism, that these are issues that grow out of increased industrialization and a kind of overly intellectual, mechanistic, scientific worldview. He says that the left wing traditionally prior to the 60s, like the Marxists and also, I guess, other kind of less openly Marxist but like left wing social democratic critics of the establishment, made the mistake of blaming capitalism, while capitalism was only really one form of the same kind of industrialized issues, which he sees also in the Soviet Union, and he also gives the example of the National Health Service. What he says is that human society increasingly is a kind of self-replicating society of managers and administrators, and he describes how the education system prepares young people to participate in this in a kind of life which has no real meaning or vitality. Here is a quote. "We call it education, the life of the mind, the pursuit of truth, but it is a matter of machine tooling the young to the needs of our various baroque bureaucracies, corporate, governmental, military, trade union, educational." So he sees education as basically creating a mechanized tool-like individual who is then fit into one of these industrialized bureaucratic systems. He says free enterprise, we call it, but it's actually a vastly restrictive system of oligarchy and market manipulation, which actually is even more true today. If you look at how America continually talks about the free market, but when you look at what the free market is in reality, it's Elon Musk, it's Jeff Bezos, it's the 1% of the 1%. What he says about education is really striking to me, because I remember having this experience as a 19-year-old. When I went to university the first time, I studied literature because I wanted to be a writer and a poet. I later became a psychologist, but my initial desire was to be a writer. So I went and studied English literature, and I remember in the first week I was sitting in a lecture hall with about 500 other people around my age, 18, 19 years old, and the lecturer said, "Most of you will not become writers. Most of you will never really think about literature much again once you've finished here. You've come here to get a degree, and you'll go on to get jobs in the city, in civil service, and all you really want is a bachelor degree as a qualification. And so I'm going to show you how to write an English literature essay never having read the book. You should be able to pick any paragraph from any book and you should be able to use it to support your thesis. And this for me was the most demotivating thing I could possibly hear at the beginning of a graduate study, because I had come there to learn about literature, and what I was told is that I was being tooled up to participate in the bureaucratic society in exactly the way that Roszak is describing in this book from 1969. This was still happening at least in 2000. So he says that the major opposition to this in the 1960s was coming from the young people, from Allan Ginsberg, from the hippies, from dropouts, from people who were living in communes. He describes why he believes this is the case, and he talks about how, although opposition in America at this time was bound up with adolescence and young adulthood, that he felt that there were important things to learn from these groups. At the time Theodore Roszak was writing this book, what he called the technocracy, the kind of self-replicating, industrial, technocratic society, was selling itself as a world of reason, pragmatism, and rationality. At the same time as it was conducting wars, it was replicating the previous generation's racial apartheid in the United States, and America was involved in a Cold War where at any time the world could have been destroyed, or like the vast majority of the world's population could have been killed in nuclear disaster. So he is making the point that the technocracy has an inherent irrational criminality, which it kind of smooths over with a scientific worldview and a scientific language. In chapter 2, Invasion of the Centaurs, he argues that the counterculture is a healthy instinct which refuses, both at the personal and at the political level, to participate in the technocracy's inherent criminality. He quotes the radical anti-psychiatrist R.D. Laing, who was a British anti-psychiatrist, as saying, "We do not need theories so much as we need the experience that is the source of the theory." And he argues that much of the 60s counterculture is based around this idea that rather than intellectual cerebral argumentation, the goal was to kind of seek experience that would provide some kind of response to, reaction to, opposition to a society that was inherently insane. Roszak argues that this involves drawing upon the non-intellective powers of the personality, by which he means everything that is dissociated from a purely intellectual perspective of the world. He means feelings, community, empathy, the body. And he says that many older traditions prior to the 20th century already had a language, a vast and beautiful set of metaphors to describe these less intellectual aspects of human experience. So he talks about the romantics, he talks about Hinduism, Buddhism, but he says that the scientific intelligence rejects metaphor, and that all of these rich and beautiful traditions, which gave us ways of living in the world rather than trying to dominate the world, are wholesale rejected by the scientific or scientistic worldview. He says even psychoanalysis, which was concerned for the first time within kind of mainstream science with the irrational, was at least initially, like under Freud, only interested in the irrational in order to try to exercise it, get rid of it, or to turn it into the rational. So the question that he asks is why the rejection of non-intellectual or what he calls non-intellective aspects of the personality, aspects of humanity. And he says that these things are perceived as dangerous. They're perceived as the gateway to irrationality, nihilism, mania, and ultimately fascism. And you might think of somebody like the QAnon shaman, or like contemporary conspiracy theorists in general who are kind of, in some ways, kind of anti-science, anti-vaccine, etc., as being some evidence of this. And I think there's some interesting arguments to be made from the perspective of 2025 against this kind of argumentation that Theodore Roszak is making. But on the other hand, he does point out that the Holocaust would have been impossible without administrators like Eichmann. He says, okay, Hitler might have come on like this kind of romantic figure, but the concentration camps and the final solution, all of that was staffed by very pragmatic, bureaucratic administrators. Chapter 3, The Dialectics of Liberation, Herbert Marcuse and Norman Brown. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this chapter. This is basically an essay where Roszak is setting up Herbert Marcuse and Norman Brown. I don't know Norman Brown, I only know Marcuse, but he's setting them up as like two people who are in disagreement, but both of whom have a project of kind of synthesizing the works of Freud and Marx. So how do you apply Freud's insights to political liberation? And the major question of this chapter, essentially, is to what extent the Cultural Revolution is a political revolution, and to what extent it is an inner revolution. To what extent is it a revolution of the personality, and to what extent is it a revolution of pragmatic social change? And his argument is certainly that it needs to be both, and the question is to what extent is it either one of these, or what kind of balance needs to be struck. Chapter 4, Journey to the East and Points Beyond, Allan Ginsberg and Alan Watts. This is another chapter that takes two writers or theorists from the time and sets them up against each other or in a kind of dialogue. And this chapter is more about the interest of the hippies and the counterculture in Eastern religion, particularly Zen Buddhism, and how the poet Allan Ginsberg and the other Beat Generation writers introduced a lot of this thinking and these interests into the youth culture of the 1960s. What Roszak ultimately says in this chapter is that even if the young people of the 60s didn't understand Zen in any way that like a genuine Zen Buddhist would have understood it, what they took from it was a kind of gentle rejection of this positivistic, compulsively cerebral way of viewing the world that the technocracy uses as its kind of only acceptable point of argumentation or only acceptable vision for society. He says that Zen was a way of understanding that the everyday wonder of the world, just the incredible complexity and beauty of a tree or the sublime nature of a sunrise, is accessible to everybody. This chapter also talks about the kind of scientific jargon which is used to obscure the obscenity of technocratic society. Examples that Roszak gives are, for example, deterrence, used as a word for the mass bombing and the use of Agent Orange and napalm in Vietnam, urban renewal as the displacement of poor people. Some examples that we have in contemporary technocratic society are, for example, collateral damage, meaning the death of civilians, or in my work in psychiatric hospitals, they talk a lot about production numbers, by which they mean how many people you have managed to speak to, and particularly how many therapies you have ended it within the space of a year or a week or a day, depending on what it is they're trying to measure. And he talks about Allan Ginsberg and Alan Watts and their kind of Buddhist and Hinduism informed view of the world, providing a rejection of this kind of fake scientific language which is used to obscure reality. He also talks about how ritual is also a part of technocracy. So, elections, for example, political rallies are also rituals, and how the youth culture of the 60s created alternative rituals like sit-ins, different types of demonstrations, that they used to have love-ins, where people would all meet up and like kiss and sing as a kind of rejection of the militaristic political rallies of the time. Chapter 5, The Counterfeit Infinity, the Use and Abuse of Psychedelic Experience. So this chapter is about how the counterculture of the 60s was very interested in drug use, and particularly psychedelics, and perhaps particularly LSD. And the writer Theodore Roszak is not totally against the use of psychedelics. He talks about Henry James, Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts as people who used psychedelic substances, mind-expanding substances, in quite a rigorous scientific way to try to understand or experiment with consciousness. And he talks particularly about Aldous Huxley as someone who had thought so much about consciousness and the mind already at the time when he did his mescaline experiments for the Doors of Perception, that it was like a genuine progression from his already existing thinking. And he says that both Huxley and Alan Watts talk about the metaphor of the microscope as LSD being like a microscope. And he says a microscope is only useful if you know how to use it. If you use it as a toy, you won't learn anything. So he's very skeptical to like the mass propagation of LSD and to young people just tripping all the time. He doesn't think that necessarily anything will be learned from this. And he's particularly critical of Timothy Leary, who had a kind of like religious attitude to LSD and went around promoting it in a sort of cult-like fashion. What I didn't know, actually, which comes up in this book, so really interesting, is that Timothy Leary was being prosecuted for narcotics possession, and I think lost his position at a university as a consequence. And his lawyer made as a defense religious freedom, and this coincided with Timothy Leary becoming more like religious in his talking about LSD and creating a kind of cult around it. Roszak stops short of saying that this is why, but he very much hints towards the fact that Timothy Leary maybe was doing this whole thing as a kind of obfuscation of his own use or mystification of his own drug use because he was in some legal difficulties. Ultimately, in this chapter, Roszak ends up saying that the idea that the use of psychedelics will lead to a better society is only an extension of the same logic that the technocracy's behavioral technicians already have, where they believe that you can modify people's behavior just by finding the right balance of medication or drugs. And that's, I think, is kind of the situation today. Like in America, you have dispensaries, which I think is a great thing. I think it's good that marijuana was decriminalized in America. But you have dispensaries in many states. Lots of people are on ADHD medication. You have loads of people on antidepressants. You have people experimenting with ketamine and psilocybin for depression. So all of this is kind of integrated into technocratic society, and nothing's become any more revolutionary as a result. Chapter 6, Exploring Utopia, the Visionary Sociology of Paul Goodman. This chapter is really interesting, and I'm not going to try to summarize it really because I think it's a bit difficult to summarize. I don't actually know Paul Goodman, and he's one of the few writers referenced in this book who I've never heard of, which is interesting to me because it's quite evident in the way that Roszak is writing about him that at the time he was probably more well known and respected than many of the other people like Allan Watts and Ginsberg, who are now like household names. Goodman appears to have been both a novelist and a theorist and a Gestalt therapist. And so some of this chapter is about how Gestalt, which is like a style of therapy where you try to focus on the whole, so the whole person or the whole situation or the whole phenomenon, how this way of viewing the world is in opposition to the kind of scientific view of the world where you always try to look at the parts. You always try to break everything down to its fundamental constituent details. So like thought is understood as electrical firing in the at synaptic level, whereas Goodman in Gestalt will be looking at the entire person or the whole context. There are other strands throughout this chapter which come back later, are about anarchism and communitarianism, and about this as kind of a sort of ethical rejection of the atomized nature of technocratic society. Chapter 7, The Myth of Objective Consciousness. This chapter, which is towards the end of the book, is where Roszak really goes all out trying to explain what he thinks has gone wrong in the way we think about the world and society and the way that things are structured. He talks about how we have this kind of dedication in the 20th century, and I would argue into the 21st century, towards that everything's supposed to be objective. And he says that objectivity essentially is a myth, and that we've created a kind of walled off and narrow idea of consciousness, which is supposed to be objective. So he argues that experts and administrators basically rule the world in the technocracy. And the example that he gives is the university, which is run by middle managers and administrators. He says administrators have nothing to do with the reality of education, rather the illusory complexity of running an educational institution. And the same is true, for example, of a psychiatric hospital where I work, where most of the people making decisions are not therapists. They are different types of bureaucrat, none of whom understand anything about psychotherapy. Roszak also makes an interesting argument that science in our culture has a sort of is a kind of mythology. He says that mythology essentially is that collectively created thing which crystallizes the great central values of a culture, and that our culture is organized around science as the dominant myth. An example that he gives here is, the Secretary of Defense can tell the public of an overkill capacity, the ability to kill any enemy 10 times over. And another example he gives is a computer technician who proposes a war on sleep. Now, the point of these examples, which are drawn from the period in which Theodore Roszak is writing, is that completely insane ideas are made to seem reasonable, sensible, or acceptable because you have this kind of rationalist, scientific guiding mythology in the society. Two examples that immediately came to mind for me when I was reading this that are from more recent times are things that I've heard in the past couple of months. One of them is this idea that artificial intelligence within a few years will take over most decision making, and that the important thing is to make sure that it will be able to make decisions that will be beneficial for humans. Very few people seem to be asking a question about whether it's actually desirable that AI would take over most decision making. Another example is the transhumanist idea that we'll be able to upload our consciousness to some kind of mainframe computer. This, to me, seems like a complete nightmare, but it's something that people have been talking about for at least 10, 15 years now, and that many people seem to be looking forward to. So Roszak puts forward a kind of philosophical argument about how this type of situation, this type of thinking comes about. And he argues that we have increasingly split experience into two modes, in here and out there. And in here is our kind of intellectual thinking mind, which is structured around only that which we can rationally know, and that out there is everything else. So that's not only nature, but it's also the body, feelings, moral sentiment, sensuous enchantment, and that these things become an object for analysis. I'd like to read a passage from the book at this point. If in here did not constantly intervene in the behavior of out there, what an impossible chaos would ensue. But fortunately, in here, being vigilant and clever, is able to keep out there in line, to conquer it, to manipulate it, to improve upon it, beginning with the witless body, which is forever proving to be incompetent. In here must therefore devise forms of surgical and chemical intervention that will make sure the body sleeps, wakes, digests, excretes, grows, relaxes, feels gay, feels blue, has sex, etc. correctly and at the right time and place. In here may even devise ways to keep the body functioning indefinitely so that it does not commit the ultimate incompetence of dying. Similarly, the natural environment must be conquered and subjected to forceful improvement. Climate and landscape must be redesigned. Waste space must be made livable, meaning covered over with urban expansion into which nothing that is not man-made or man-arranged will intrude itself. To me, that seems to be quite a good description of how the Western humanity and maybe global humanity at this point approaches its place in the world. And the complete insanity of this approach is more evident today, in my opinion, than it was when he was writing, because we know now that the world is increasingly becoming uninhabitable because of this approach to it. Okay, chapter 8, Eyes of Flesh, Eyes of Fire. In this chapter, Theodore Roszak tries to put forward an alternative way of being in the world where he draws upon both the romantic tradition of people like William Blake and the prehistoric cultures of the world, plus the less industrialized, less technocratic cultures of, for example, the First Nation people prior to their assimilation into the United States of America. He says that the project of the counterculture must be as follows: to proclaim a new heaven and a new earth, so vast, so marvellous, that the inordinate claims of technical expertise must of necessity withdraw in the presence of such splendour to a subordinate and marginal status in the lives of men. And in order to do this, he argues we need visionary imagination. So what he's arguing for is kind of a new sense of the sublime, a new sense of the sacred in our relationship to the world, so that technical expertise and scientific intervention is subordinated to that and only allowed to encroach in a way that does not kind of damage or dominate that. He talks about the role of the shaman in prehistoric society, and he says that the shaman was the origin of all of the things in life that we today consider beautiful. He says that their cave paintings was the origin of art, that the oral tradition was the origin of poetry, that the shaman's tale telling was mythology, which became literature, that his masks and his movement became theatre, became dance, that the shaman also had rudimentary medicine, therapy, was a kind of moral guide. And he says that this all supports the idea of a kind of magical way of addressing the world. What he means by magic is a way of relating to the world that sees the forces of nature as if they were mindful. So he's arguing for a kind of new pantheism, a kind of experience of the world as a kind of living, meaningful and intentional phenomena space. He says that the scientific technocratic mind of the 20th century rejects this as superstition, as idiocy, as an accident, as if humans did not live for most of their historical existence in this fashion. And he says that our current approximation of this, the closest we come, is compartmentalized experiences of nature that we use as respite from our technocratic everyday life. And he says that this is a complete disaster. And he describes our situation today thus: the old magic that could illuminate the sacramental presence in a tree, a pond, a totem, is derided as a form of superstition unworthy of civilized men. Nothing we come upon in the world can any longer speak to us in its own right. But he points out that most people don't understand the very basics of the kind of science that is supposed to be the true way of understanding the world. That only, that most of us are not quantum physicists or expert physicists, most of us are not marine biologists, that we are robbed of our immediate magical experience of the world at the same time as we do not have access to what is considered to be the correct way of viewing the world. At the end, he argues that what we can take from the counterculture of the 1960s is not only participatory democracy, but the understanding that what we participate in needs to be understood as the ultimate ground of all existence. That is to say that the magic, the sublime nature of the world is available to all who are open to it, and that it is this that we participate in when we democratically participate. And he uses as a kind of image or a figure or a metaphor for this the Paleolithic tribe who was living in community with nature and with one another in a relatively non-hierarchical fashion. That is my summary of the arguments in The Making of a Counterculture. Something else that I found interesting about it that I'll say in closing is that he allows himself a certain degree of intellectual elitism at the same time as he takes very seriously groups of people like the hippies who were not taken seriously much otherwise. And he argues for poetry, literacy, at the same time as he's arguing for these kind of less intellectual, physical, bodily, emotional aspects of the self. And that's quite a liberating and inspiring perspective that I don't think you really hear very much at this point in history. Exactly how one can take this perspective and implement it is something that I'm going to have to live with and think about over the coming weeks. I'd love to hear your opinions about it. And this thing about the kind of dangers of anti-intellectualism or the non-intellective parts of the personality that you see in maybe in the wellness movement or that you see in the anti-vax movement, and the way that some of this has been co-opted by the far right is something that obviously he was unable to foresee at the time when he was writing this book. But it doesn't necessarily discredit his argument, in my opinion, because you don't see any sense of the wild world as sacred in those schools of thought or those perspectives. At least I don't think you do. Have you read this book? If so, what do you think about it? Have you read Goodman? Because if you have, please let me know what you think about his writing. This book made me really curious about that. And yeah, feel free to continue the conversation in the comments. I always love to hear from you. See you again soon.